We're going to talk about some recommended improvements for Bank Street, and that is that segment of roadway between Clarity's Plaza and the intersection of Franklin and River Streets. Representing the town tonight, we have Rory Burke from the First Selectman's Office, Fred Masori, Community Development, and also from the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments, we have Mark Nielsen off to my right. From Malona McBroom, Michael Joyce will give the majority of the presentation, and Quasi Brown will discuss traffic analyses and related topics, and I'll get back to those guys in just a moment. Naturally, Route 67 is a state route, and so we work in close coordination with the DOT. As we make recommendations, we've got to satisfy certain needs of the state and the best interest of the town as well, and the folks who utilize or reside in the corridor. Let me just jump back. 1991, there was a consultant, VHB, similar firm to ours. They prepared a study of Route 67. They studied 67 through Southbury, Oxford, and Seymour, and they looked at operational and safety concerns in the corridor, and they made a certain set of recommendations. We're here tonight to talk about some of those recommendations that were made for the Seymour stretch. Fast forward about 20 years, and the Valley Council of Governments engaged Malona McBroom to take a fresh look at the corridor, given the passage of time. Certain developments had occurred. The building at the corner of River and Franklin, the old lumber yard is down and the site's vacant. We had a Walgreens came before us. Actually, when Walgreens was constructed, they made some of the improvements that were recommended by VHB back in 1991, signalization and operational changes at Old Drive. And our charge was to reassess the corridor and go back, take a look at those recommendations, and either validate, confirm, or refine those recommendations. And Mike will talk about where we're going to go one step further in some areas. But also, there's been a more recent focus on bicycle and pedestrian mobility, safety for bicycles and pedestrians, trying to encourage folks to get out of the motor vehicle and look for alternative modes of travel. And so we actually did things like a walking audit, say, a hands-on walking audit from the plaza all the way down to River and Franklin, loop all the way around River to where we are tonight and back, and look at the gaps in the sidewalk system and the areas where it's uncomfortable to bicycle or walk. And we're able to incorporate some of those improvements into our plans for the stretch of highway that I mentioned. Where we are is we're in a preliminary engineering study. Once we have concurrence between the state and the town, we would go ahead then with design and then eventually construction. But part of the process is what we call public outreach. And public outreach is great, but it's actually required by the state and federal partners. Just this past week, we hosted a couple of stakeholder meetings, which I know many of you attended, where we talked to the folks who are directly impacted by the work, folks that live or work in the corridor. And tonight's meeting is the same presentation, but it's a little more global to open to the town-wide forum. So with your input, as you can imagine, with any such project, it's all about balancing. You've got to balance the needs of the transportation infrastructure, but then we have impacts to the environment, the natural resources, the properties, et cetera, and it becomes a delicate balancing act. So Mike Joyce will give the bulk of the presentation. My background is a highway designer. Quasi's focuses on traffic, and he'll contribute with some of the more technical aspects of the project as well. Thank you.
Good evening again. For the record, my name is Michael Joyce, professional engineer with Malona McBroom. I see many familiar faces tonight, but I do see some new faces. Those of you who were at our stakeholder meetings last week, we did supply some handouts for you. For those of you who were not able to come last week, I do have extra handouts for you this evening. If you just raise your hand, I'll pass them around now. I do have a few extra copies up here too if we need some after the meeting for anyone who's not quite familiar enough with the projects yet. Again, thank you once again for coming. We really appreciate your input. Last week we had for two meetings on October 13th and October 15th. We did that as an intentional invitation to the property owners in the project limits to understand what you know about the corridor. While some of this presentation tonight may seem repetitive for those of you who saw it before, maybe even twice in some cases, we need to conduct that for those who weren't there at the meeting and also conduct it formally as part of the public information process for the state of Connecticut and for the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments. As we walked our way through the corridor last time, we first started off talking about what does our corridor look like? What are the issues out there? Again, we're not here to tell you how much you know the corridor. These are our observations. You gave us valuable input last week as far as what you thought was the real focal points for that. Again, we start about our project limits. Our project limits start from Clarity's Village down to the intersection of Bank and Franklin and River Street at the Naugatuck River Bridge. Looking east up the corridor, these pictures show the beginning of the project limits as they start to look west, moving up toward the Bank Street. You'll notice some of the photos here show some of the buildings that used to be on the corner of River and Franklin and Bank, since been demolished. They also start to show the merge condition that we all talked about last week, and also the parking situation on the corner of Franklin and Bank Street. Those of you who know or may not have witnessed it, the merge condition is one of the primary safety factor issues within the corridor. There's a race to the finish line, so to speak, as you approach Martha Street and then the intersection up at Walgreens. As part of this project, and we'll explain this in more detail, that's one of the primary focal points of improving safety along the corridor. We will. I'm going to go through and understand the existing, and we'll get to the proposed improvements at the end, but thank you. I will. Excellent. And as we understand the corridor, we work our way up, we look at different things. Tony mentioned about the audit, the pedestrian circulation study that we had done through the corridor, identifies not only the traffic issue, but also the pedestrian issues that occur within the corridor. You can see deteriorated sidewalk conditions. You can see on-street parking that's in close proximity to the intersection of Franklin and Bank Street. Not ideal. And also you've got retaining walls supporting historic properties. These are some of the limitations we had in the corridor as far as what we could impact or we couldn't impact. Again, as we work our way further up the corridor and looking at pedestrian circulation through the corridor in addition to traffic, we also notice that there's conditions where the sidewalks don't meet handicap accessibility standards, whether because of condition or width, ramps, crossings, etc. Some of the restrictions. You also see on this side, on the upper right-hand corner, some of the embankments and slopes that restrict our ability to widen the road toward that side without excessive retaining walls and excessive costs. As Tony mentioned, there's been some improvements in the corridor. Walgreens performed some of the improvements recommended back in the 1991 study, and also part of their planning and zoning approvals and their state encroachment permit. Those improvements extended and provided a direct right turn lane, an exclusive right turn lane for the development. As we'll explain in the rest of the presentation, we're going to expand upon that to help improve that condition for vehicles who are traveling through the corridor to the west on Bank Street and also onto Old Drive. As we turn our focus to the other side of the street, we start understanding what other impacts we may have on the properties. As you can see here, these pictures represent and illustrate the close proximity to some of the businesses, the porches, the driveways, driveways, the walkways and stairs that extend very close to the edge of pavement. You've got limited on-street parking, 10-minute parking in some areas. You've got parking on the sidewalk that occurs quite frequently. Because of our restrictions, not only on the northern side slopes, but also on Martha Street, we're limited to how much we can widen that direction without creating an unsafe condition there, which forces any of the widening we do to the south side of the street. And as we've identified in our report, one of the impacts, or several of the impacts we've identified, are to the property owners, both the cleaners and the residential properties that are on the south side, that we anticipate those will likely be full acquisitions should this project move forward. As we work our way back down toward River Street and Bank, we start to look at the improvements that are necessary on River Street to help the traffic operations for the overall corridor. You can see on the right-hand side a picture of the sidewalk on the Naugatuck River Bridge. There is a pedestrian connection that works its way east to downtown. It is limited on some factors when it comes to ADA accessibility, but improvements to that bridge are not part of this corridor project. What was not identified in the original 1991 study was the length or extent of improvements necessary on River Street. River Street's a state Route 313. We've identified, and we discussed last week, the ability for vehicles to turn left onto Route 67 creates quite a backup or a queue, where vehicles often either wait in line or choose other routes, such as West Street, come up over the hill, take the shortcut to the next traffic light that's there. West Street, now that forces trucks, which shouldn't be going in that direction, up and over the hill in a manner that shouldn't be there. Part of this project is going to look to improve that queue and that delay that currently occurs at the intersection. As we continue up the corridor and look at our existing conditions, we look at the intersection of Church and Beecher Street. Church Street comes down at a sharp grade, intersects with Beecher Street right at the intersection of Bank Street. Not much space difference between the intersection of Church and Beach and Church and Bank Street at that location. Beecher Street is a one-way road going up the hill. Church Street is two-way. And then both those streets connect up into the south to West Street. Again, not explaining these in too much detail. You've seen these before. You live in this neighborhood. You understand the restrictions and how these areas are used. We had some additional information provided to us during the public information stakeholder meetings indicating certain ownership that may exist within the area. That'll be information we'd like to be able to receive and make part of the record of this public information meeting. As we continue to the west up the corridor, we look at the intersection of Johnson Avenue. Today we have a condition where you have a tight skewed angle, one-way entrance back onto Route 63, very difficult left-turning sight line as you look over your shoulder trying to pull out of that area. As the property owner who lives up on top of the hill expressed, a lot of times people use her driveway as a default turnaround. That's not a permissible activity today, but it happens by default. As we get into our discussion a little bit further, some of the improvements recommended more formalize that. While there's not a lot of traffic there, it has been identified as a safety concern. We do have to focus on it. If it's an issue that needs to be addressed in the corridor or as a spot improvement, it will be addressed in the overall final design. And our last area of focus for physical improvements is the intersection of the Claridis Village unsignalized exit and entrance that currently exists. As you know, there's a signalized entrance further up the road to the west, and there is a two-way entrance at the McDonald's driveway. Across the street from that, if you've driven out of there, there's a no left turn sign. But nobody listens to that, exactly. So as part of this project, we're looking to formalize and deter that from happening by providing an island, and we'll get into those details in a moment. Yeah. Well, we will, I'll go through the details and we can explain exactly how we're going to achieve some of those improvements in a moment. And then we can more easily ask and answer those questions for you. But as we talk about the overall improvements to the corridor, traffic signalization is a big part of it. Timing sequences along the corridor are an issue. Some of the signals are not synchronized properly, so they time the right way as you drive through the corridor. Signage. Certain standards exist now that didn't exist back then. It's a manual on uniform traffic control devices determines what types of signs should be uniform for everyone to look at. Reflectivity, you can see them at night, that kind of thing. So those are the kind of improvements that we can implement as part of the project. It makes things more visible for people to see the traffic signal signage and the traffic signal appurtenances. What Kwesi is going to describe in a moment here is that this is a computer simulation of the future traffic conditions without the improvements. And he'll explain how that model was developed, what the assumptions were made as part of that. And again, I'll introduce Kwesi Brown.
Thank you, Mike. So we basically developed this model using a software called Vism. And the idea behind it was to, first of all, be able to really identify where the issues are within the corridor, but also to validate the improvements that we definitely propose. So I just want to sort of give you perspective. So what you see right now is the intersection of River, Franklin, and Bank. Bank is going east-west. Then you got Franklin on the north, and then Bank, River on the south. You can see that there's definitely some queuing issues, particularly in the westbound direction on Bank. And then you also see that whole margin. So that creates some traffic issues as well. And as you go east on the corridor, you're right now going past the Walgreens intersection, going towards, on Bank Street, going towards Beecher, and you can see some queuing on Church Street. And that's primarily because of, vehicles not being able to find gaps within the network to be able to make a left turn out. And it has to do with sort of the way that the traffic signals are synchronized. So that's also an issue that we were able to identify. And then as you go further, in the west on the corridor, you get into the Claridis Plaza area. At this point here, the traffic is not as congested as you would find at the River Street intersection. And again, just to give some background, this model here is the PM peak condition, which we identified as the worst condition peak period within the corridor. So basically, what we found is this model sort of validates the issues that are out there in terms of level of service, in terms of queuing, and in terms of delay within the corridor. As we go further in, we'll be able to then talk about the recommendations that we made and how that those recommendations benefit the entire corridor. But again, this is another run through the simulation, and we'll have a chance to talk about the improvements in terms of traffic operations.
So what we've, some of the background behind how that model was prepared is that part of our assignment was for us to go out and to count, actually physically count vehicles during the corridor during different peak hours. It's a representation of the approximate peak for vehicles. We know there's variations that occur from different times of day and different events. There's factors that can come up. We talked about buses at one particular time coming in the corridor that can slow things down. You're right. Some of these models are very picky. And no, it's fine. No, but that's the reality of the situation. So and that's anecdotally sometimes when we're doing our traffic studies, and if there's a unique feature in a neighborhood that we don't necessarily see, that's not as visible as what you see from day to day and week to week to month, that's what we want to hear. So as part of those and that's often how once a signalization project is implemented, that's how the state will come back and look at like a 30-day test period and say, is it working right? And they can make some adjustments and timings here and there to help tweak that so that it's the best for the neighborhood. Again, we're working off computer models. We're not going to assume it's perfect, but we do. The software has evolved to the point now where we believe it accurately represents the average peak hour condition that we have out there. Right. This week.
But when we set the tool, we're allowed to try to light add a length. Here will tell us whether or not it's help. It's purely
Yeah.
Once we have this existing the conditions model without the improvements, then you're able to see the benefits once you introduce the improvements within the network, because the same volumes that you're looking at is the same operations, but now with geometric improvements and with signal timing improvements, and then you're able to see the benefits. So we'll be able to show that. We are going to show that.
So that's our first step. We run through the analysis. We find out what the current conditions look like. And that forms the platform for our recommendations for how much we have to widen the lanes. The output from that analysis, well, it's a pretty picture here. There's actually a technical output that tells us, all right, how many cars stack up at the left turn lane? How long does that car have to wait? Do we need to add an additional lane? Do we have add an additional turn lane? Do we have to make that turn lane longer? So that's the background for how we developed what's now the improvements. And as we went through this last week, this graphic here represents the same improvements that are right behind me on the colored board. On the isolated, this is the same picture you see on the presentation screen, colored up a little bit. As we mentioned last week, the yellows represent the areas where pavement is being widened or improved. The orange represents sidewalk improvement areas. The green is the area where we're giving back some pavement into some vegetated areas. Again, as we mentioned, through this analysis, we've identified that we need to fix first the race to the finish line as you approach Martha. And in doing that, well, what do we do that? We don't want to kick that further down the road to the next intersection. I don't know the history behind the first construction of that. We have identified that it is a very short distance for people to get to quickly. That's the issue. There's not enough time for people to make that decision. They've just passed this, a very large intersection. It's a very large intersection. It's very expansive. It's very wide. We talked a little bit about last week, and we'll go into a detail again about just the size of the pavement area there. As you cross through that pavement, yeah, so you're kind of stuck with what you had before. You got parking in some spots, a lot of distractions going on, side streets coming in. This plan hopes to simplify that. We talked about the elimination of parking at the corner of Franklin and Bank Street. It helps. That's one less maneuver that's coming in and out of your field of vision as you're trying to work through the area. As you work through the corridor again, the right turn lane that's been established for Walgreens serves as an opportunity for us to continue that pattern should you want to extend up Old Drive. This plan, as shown in the yellow, proposes to continue that as a continued right turn lane for people who want to stay in that lane and not merge back with the 67 traffic and continue up Old Drive. Granted, it's not a dominant movement in the corridor for people to come through, but it isn't a movement in the corridor that people do use. Okay, so coming from Old Drive, if you're walking from McDonald's, currently you have an improved condition. The state has been replacing that bridge in the cantilever section, so that new bridge connection will be picked up. We'll pick up at the end of that improvement and continue the sidewalks fairly uniformly down through this area. It's the extension and widening and improvement of that sidewalk through here that really creates those frontage impacts to the properties that are located along the southern side of Bank Street today, the cleaners and the residential homes that are there. We're also, as part of this study, we looked at pedestrian circulation even outside this area. Went up Old Drive. There's a platform cantilevered sidewalk that walks its way around the river, around Old Drive in that area. While not in this project, it's been identified as something maybe in the future that could be improved to provide a little safer pedestrian access to that area. This sidewalk that currently exists now that goes up to Old Drive will be replaced as this road gets widened. There will be an extension and a shifting of the crosswalk to the lower side of Walgreens to cross people here. Gives a little bit more room for the guide rail transitions that have to occur in that area, a little safer for the vehicles, and it gets the pedestrians further away from the bridge, which does have some height restriction issues when it comes to how visible people are and the pedestrians as they come through the intersection. Pushes people, the pedestrians, a little further away from the stop bar condition, which we know that people come to quite quickly sometimes as they travel through the corridor. Well, what we'll do, as Tony mentioned before, we are in the preliminary engineering stage. Mm-hmm. Yep, and as much as the foresight for that is not may not be supportive under they're going to have to relocate those facilities should this project move forward. That's a reality they have to deal with as part of the project. It won't stop this project from where they put their poles. It's just an unfortunate condition if they put it in a location. Oftentimes, they're not allowed to put new utility poles in if they need them until the new project is ready for construction and we're within 1 foot of grade and the elevations are already understood. So there is a limitation here, as we'll get into at the end of the presentation. The timeline for the project, we're in a preliminary engineering study. We're not into the construction dollars yet or the final design dollars yet. So this is the step that's necessary in order to request the funding necessary to build these improvements. As we work our way back down the corridor to the east, we talk about widening and improving the turn lanes so we can get better access for vehicles that want to go through the corridor and also vehicles that want to go down River Street. We talked a little bit, and you saw in the simulation how the cars in the current condition have to find that yellow left turn lane just about where the bridge is today. You have to kind of work your way in there. And if they can't get in there and they're backing up, anybody going through to Franklin and everybody turning right onto Bank Street going toward the highway has to wait or find alternate routes. And that's often what they do is they find their alternate routes. As we look at that, we understand not only is that important to here, but that may be important for future development opportunities on the north side of Bank Street off Franklin as well. So there may be some access through traffic that's going to be a demand in the future that's currently not there. So that's when we look at these future volumes and future conditions. We look at a 20-year projection out into the future. Well, what could be out there? How could that traffic grow? As we work our way again through the corridor, we talked a little bit. This is how much further here's the location of the existing bridge today. We're about doubling the length of that left turn lane to get vehicles into that turn lane sooner, reduce the stacking area, get vehicles back into the through lane, and hopefully move people out of the corridor and turn left. Is it going to prevent the people cutting through West Street? No. People are going to do what they need to do. We're going to provide the best improvement we can in this location that the funding will allow and that the corridor can handle. We wouldn't need the bridge itself, while it's fairly narrow. It does support the width we need for the turn lanes and through lanes that we have. What it doesn't support is the continuation of a bike lane through that area, a bike shoulder in that area. So that's one of the restrictions we have as far as working through here, is that if we wanted to add sidewalks, we'd have to do either a cantilever section or possibly an independent bridge over the stretch of the channel there. The next phase, if you wanted to go into sidewalks on the road, would be the widening of that culvert. But again, we believe that the real pedestrian connection is really to get ourselves back to downtown without, other certain plans. There's other projects that we're going to discuss later on tonight that provide connections to the Tingyu Dam project and the other areas downtown that we feel is the higher priority for sidewalk and pedestrian connections. There is. There's actually 3 lanes here. This is to eastbound. The through and the right, the movements that we're proposing there are not enough to demand an extra right turn lane for that area. The predominant movement is the right turn in that area. And under the signalization, the delay is not here. It's more caused by the queue length of the turning vehicles turning left out of the area. We don't find a problem with the through movements and the right turn movements coming through this area. If I understand correctly, I don't think there's a demand for that. I'll go back to that for a minute. As we mentioned during last week's meeting, is that we're also taking a look at the corridor and this study from an aesthetic standpoint. We see opportunities to create more of a Main Street feel to Route 67, whether it be through sidewalk treatments or other areas. This corner of River Street and Bank Street today, and this edge right here represents the approximate edge of where the pavement and the curb line is today. It's a very broad, very wide radius. Talked about, creates a very wide pavement section in this area, big sea of asphalt in the area. We don't need that for the trucks that take the turns through that area. We can actually reduce that and create a little more green space to this intersection, create more of a focal point for people who are starting to get into what's becoming a recreational area in town. You're getting near the river, you're getting near the future the bike trail that's going to connect. You're working your way into downtown. You can pick up on different themes that are downtown, whether it be lighting, sidewalk treatments, etc., so that you can create, more of a Seymour feel to this than a State Road feel to Bank Street.
I think for years our answer was solving traffic at more pavement, but whenever we steal a little pavement back,
I'm sorry, repeat that. With any new project that's being constructed now, it includes the resetting of these utility castings. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Understood. Yeah. I completely understand the concern, the comment. This project is, like I said, we're in the stage right now. That's a maintenance issue. The new projects that are constructed will be designed to bring utilities to grade, flush with grade, so that they're not. That's part of the design. What happens? Should it move forward with maintenance? Is that? Well, and I'll back up for a minute. Is that part of the moving forward is for us to complete a successful public outreach process to gain your comments. The DOT has reviewed the design from the preliminary engineering stage. We have to incorporate public comments. If there's issues that need to be addressed that could be incorporated into the future project, we'll do that. If there's some major issue that would stop the project, we would need to know that. Again, that's why we're here tonight, to gain your input, to move things forward. We believe what we've heard so far are things that we can address and work into the projects. Again, final design of a project includes a higher level of detail into a lot of specifics. This is what's possible, what's feasible in the corridor. What's a problem? Well, how can we fix it? Yes, ma'am. It's a state intersection. Certain elements of it, if the town chooses to sponsor the area, could be a sponsored program by the town. That is yet to be determined. If those improvements are actually even made. We're at that point in time right now where we're including some of those elements into the funding so they can be built. The town can make a decision whether or not they feel they want to maintain those or not. That's a future decision that has to be made. At this stage of the game, we're just showing that we're not forgetting that we want to make sure that we'd like to be able to make the corridor look as attractive as possible for people who are going to be here when we're gone. I live in a different town. I'm not going to drive through here as often as you do, but we don't want to forget that you want to look at something nice in your town. If we didn't bring it up, it would be a question for someone to ask. We want to bring it up now. How it gets maintained, the town can work out the details at that point. But I understand your concern. Where's the budget for that? Who's going to take care of it? Those are very valid questions. I don't have the answers for those. That's a municipal question. But some of those improvements could be state maintained, and some of them could be, the sidewalks could be state maintained, and the landscaping could be a town maintenance item. So as we shift our focus, and again, the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments, as I mentioned last week, has referred to this project, asked us to refer to this project as a spot improvement program. Originally, it was corridor improvement. The reason for that is that should any of these improvements move forward, they would be able to be funded possibly individually, so that if one of these couldn't go, it wouldn't stop the other projects or the improvements from happening. The next spot improvement, as we work up the corridor, would be the intersection of Beecher and Church Street. We spoke about this at length at our last couple stakeholder meetings with a lot of input from the Russian Club at the intersection of Beecher and Church. Some of the things we focused on, and we look back at some of the pictures we had, was that there are some steep grades on Church Street that come down. And one of the alternates we looked at, and again, the alternates are in our preliminary engineering report, was to take Church Street and intersect it directly with Bank Street. The steep grade that occurs here, we shorten the distance from here to here on that elevation change, creates a steeper landing, not something as engineers we want to recommend. Beecher Street is being one way up. Under this proposal, and while the arrows are not shown in this graphic, this would propose Church Street coming to a stop condition at the bottom. By shifting this intersection up the hill, we have the ability to raise the elevation of Church Street a little bit and create a little bit more of a landing, a softer landing. We understand that does come right through the current island that's there. It separates the Russian Club from the intersection. Some utility relocations have to occur. The biggest improvement that occurs here, though, is the addition of 2 lanes exiting the intersection. Right now, a left-turning vehicle, as demonstrated, can starve the ability for people to take the right turns back onto Bank Street. The ability to create 2 lanes, a left turn lane and a right turn lane there at that location, is critical to make that intersection improve much more efficiently, especially for the Church Street residents. You can see on this part of the graphic, not much is being proposed to change. The approach, we don't see a real problem with the left turning movement. It's until you have to actually take your gap and find your gap. It's an unsignalized intersection here, and it's going to remain that way. To put another signal this close to 2 other signals is not something that's recommended by the state. No, it's a painted median. That painted median is just there to protect the vehicles that are in these lanes, so that someone coming this way is not going head-on into the left-turning lane that's coming up Beecher Street. So again, we look at the aesthetics. We talked a little bit about what can we do with this intersection. There are uses in the area that need to be understood. We talked about it at length last week, how the residents on Beecher Street, on the businesses on Beecher Street use the pavement areas. There's limitations. There's no parking on site in a lot of these locations, so that's a challenge. How do we incorporate that? What design options can we implement to do as little impact to the properties? That's a lot of detail that will be fleshed out during some of the preliminary engineering. We're focusing primarily on the traffic signal improvements that are going to be necessary for the intersection. So while these are the layouts that are being proposed, we expect to be some minor adjustments that need to be made as we better grade and define the traffic movements as they come out of Church Street onto Bank Street. We've received your correspondence on your concerns. Those are going to all be entered into the record. We have two core pieces of correspondence that have been received during the stakeholder meetings. Those are be officially entered into the record for the public information meeting. This is just a graphic of what visually the intersection might look like. It's a photo simulation of what this might look like. This turning movement today is a very sharp movement for people come up and down Church Street and coming out again. We talked a little bit about vehicles taking a wide turn out of Church Street and swinging wide almost into oncoming traffic a little bit, trying to get that turn if they're coming out. This gives vehicles a chance to come out, turn, and then come back down again. A little more room for vehicles to make that maneuver. What we've done in the project, we've identified that the parking is an area of impact. There's no final resolution on how those parking is either recreated or identified or preserved in any manner, but it's not said that it's not going to be either. It's that the current concepts show an alignment for the roadway that's necessary for traffic operations. Those other details, property impacts, will be assessed at a later date. Now, we understand there's an ownership condition that we weren't familiar with before. As far as the property mapping the state had provided us, that I believe is at the Housatonic Wire, parcel ownerships in this area of town is actually a parcel of land on an island. And if you have any information, that would be important for that to be included in the record. That would be great. Thank you. Yeah, you're suggesting this, bringing this wider through here to get the extra right turn lane in. I didn't say we didn't say it wasn't feasible. We've established under the report with the report. We're trying to be consistent with the document that's been prepared too, and not trying to veer off that too much with too many different alternatives at this time. The preferred alternate at the time the report was prepared is what you see before you. Are there other design considerations that'll be entertained during their final design process? Absolutely. As part of this, we go through intersection grading plans, we go through sightline analysis, we go through different turning movements for vehicles. If we determine that there's a slightly different arrangement here that can do the same result, at the end of the day, we're trying to improve the traffic and safety of that intersection. If there's a slight adjustment here and there to make that work, it'll be part of that future effort. Yes, sir. The
have accident data. We have 2 accidents over a 3-year period. Yeah.
So I'm gonna go. as you saw in the earlier photo simulation, in the traffic simulation, part of what happens here today is that the current configurations there, the vehicles are not lined up in a way that gets the Church Street traffic out, they get stacked out. So that's part of the primary concern there. And anytime you delay somebody longer than you need to, they start to make decisions on their own. And they start to move, and they move it. Yeah. Okay. Correct. It does provide a turning movement improvement for vehicles taking, especially larger vehicles, and maybe coming down Church. Yep. To take your left, you're still gonna have to wait for those left turns, and you have to pick your gap. Yep. Well, today, if there's a vehicle waiting to turn left, that's blocking the ability for a car to turn right, they have to wait longer because they have to wait for a gap both in the eastbound traffic and the westbound traffic. They have to get across. So part of the improvement is to get the left-hand turning vehicle out of the way so the right-hand vehicle can take the right-hand turn and go down Bank Street. That's right. That's the primary focus of this improvement of this intersection. Yes.
Part of the when we initially looked at this, apart from just the level of service, also had to do with just the substandard layout of that intersection. I do agree that 2 accidents doesn't create the impression that there's a huge safety issue going on here. But when it was initially looked at, part of the concern was people, vehicles coming in here and having to then suddenly make a left turn into Church Street, and how that impacts other vehicles that are coming just right after that vehicle trying to make a left. So that was then also an initial concern when we initially looked at laying out this intersection.
So as we go through this preliminary engineering phase, the preliminary engineering phase is before the Department of Transportation gets into what's called the right-of-way phase for a project. So before we can even get into where the state starts to assess the impacts to businesses and properties, et cetera, in the corridor, first we have to get this, it's really a feasibility study at some level, so that there's a viability, there's a project here that has improvements that can be made. This has to be the first step to get that on the platform for funding for actual physical final design, so that at that point you can identify specifically, here's the impact, here's the options, here's the alternatives we looked at. There's another public outreach process that goes along with that. That's part of the reason why we had our meetings last week, is to solicit that, the same things you're bringing up and the same things they brought up, those letters for the record are all going to be part of this preliminary engineering study. And that's going to be captured as this thing gets moved forward to the next round of funding. They say these are the issues that need to be addressed as part of the project. These are valid issues. How do they incorporate it? It could mean that they adjust the funding estimate and say, listen, there's a property impact here that as an X or Y. So it's part of the dialogue of what that next phase has to prepare for. We don't have an answer on as far as what those will be yet, because we're not there at that point yet. We don't have a physical number of where those things are going to be, how much is a valid impact, how much DOT will fund for those impacts necessarily. There's more detailed surveys that will be occurred on the property to find out who owns what, who has rights to what, and what uses are out there today. There could be some other things that we don't know about yet that'll be part of that final design phase. Absolutely. So just to clarify the next steps that will occur. So if we get through this project successfully, we will be in a position where the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments will then propose this as a new funded project for design and construction. The first step of that is called preliminary design. Now, we call this preliminary engineering. The next is preliminary design. That's where we go through every design standard, every single item. You develop profiles, roadway alignments, more detailed traffic studies, that kind of thing, up-to-date information. That gets presented to DOT. We then have to go through another public information process, public hearing likely in that standpoint, moderated by DOT likely on the state road, where they present all the rights-of-way requirements that are part of the project. That can't move forward for final design until that process is successfully completed on a public level. So we have to go through this public process to get to the next step, which is design and construction money. And then the first step of that process is another public outreach, where we identify specifically every single property that's going to be impacted. DOT then starts their rights-of-way acquisition process, where they do title searches, they do estimates of appraisal, and the whole process it goes through and assesses specifically how everyone, not just the Russian Club, how everyone is going to be impacted as part of these improvements. Understood.
You may back up traffic like it is now, but I think this is taking the left and west. That actually went in at the turn. And I believe they just put it in that path.
Got hands. We got some hands in the back, yeah. I'm actually, I'd like for you to come up, actually. We need to get your, some of these familiar faces I've been able to document. We know who you are for the record, but I'd like you to identify yourself for the record so we can incorporate your comments efficiently. Actually, I'll need you to come up so we can capture your comments on the, and I can bring the microphone back to you if that's easier.
I have a simple question. Why can't they just make Church Street right turn only going out to 67? And it would stop all the traffic, stop all the problems, and you wouldn't have to change anything.
You could have a similar situation you have in McDonald's where there's a no left turn sign and people still take the turn. So then you start introducing islands again. So there's a balancing act that has to occur there. Again, not final. The details of how exactly that should be laid out and the safety requirements will be vetted out during the final design. What we have identified, it's definitely an area to look at for possible improvements that could be part of it, and that's why it's incorporated into the study. Yes, sir.
Go back one slide, please. Dave Bitzo, 1 Meadowwoods Road, Seymour. But I'm here on behalf of the Russian Club. I spent some time here this afternoon prior to coming down here, and I understand coming down Church Street, you got a challenging grade right here at the curve. But then as you get to the lower part, the grade actually levels off, and I'm not sure what the degree is. Don't have an engineering background, but I do have a construction background. What about on the other side of the plug, taking this piece of property and making this curb here with adding an additional lane as a merging lane to eliminate the point that this gentleman here made, which is a very good point, people fighting left versus right, and that's a very common issue. But I understand you're presenting your first choice and what you feel is your best choice, but keep in mind there's people in the area that are affected. But I think, honestly, this levels off down here to a point where you can easily make this transition from a steep grade to a soft grade and then return it around. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Ma'am, you had your hand up before?
I've never had to use a mic in a budget meeting Yeah. I don't need. Cindy Dion, 18 Carriage Drive. A couple of questions. First of all, you're talking about processes and steps that you all need to take. From start to the next step, timeline. What are you looking at? Are you looking at months? Are you looking at years? What are you looking at?
In the handout that we provided, the approximate schedule for when we would go out of this phase we're in right now, which we'll call the start phase. If we successfully complete it, we'll complete it by the end of this year, possibly. As we get into the next phase, we can expect that that will go through survey, design, permitting processes, and get to a possible construction of 2019. By the time you go through rights-of-way acquisitions, there's property owners that need to be relocated. There's residents, there's relocation assistance that has to happen. So that process alone has an 18-month to 2-year process with DOT. So from today until you see a shovel in the ground, it could be from 2000 till 2019.
The stoplight. Well, there's a stoplight coming out of, is it Rimmon? Old Drive? The amount of traffic that comes out of Old Drive compared to the amount of traffic that comes down Church is, you can't compare the two. Why not move that stoplight, do what Mr. Bitzo's recommending, and put a stoplight there as well, and move that stoplight down instead of having that stoplight on Old Town, Old Drive.
One of the things that we observed too was there is a movement too from Old Drive to Church Street and to Beecher that comes up through more to Church than it does, I think, Beecher. That comes through that area. So to have there's also some other restrictions. That's a tight turn as well there coming out of Old Drive geometrically, where this is more of a traditional T intersection here. So Old Drive tends to need the signal a little bit more in this location, given the geometric issues and also you've got Rimmon that feeds into Old Drive at that location, which is a pretty much direct connection for that neighborhood down into Route 67. The issues of backup would just be switched. You end up flip-flopping some of the issues back and forth from side to side. And we. Now, part of what was, part of it, and some of that's overlapping a little bit too, because some of the light improvements that were happening there were happening during that same study period, where the Walgreens had improved and done the signalization improvements. So some of that's a little bit overlapping, so that the numbers on the accidents and timing of when they occurred in relation to when that signal was operational is a little bit gray area.
Yes, Rich Grugis, 29 Rimmon Street there. I have to differ with the lady back there. Traffic is always backed up on Rimmon, even with the light there. You wait maybe 3-4 minutes for that light to turn, and then you take your life in your hands because cars will speed up through the intersection. And there have been, I belong to the fire department, and there has been 6 accidents within the last couple of years there, even with the light there and all. And the second thing is, I'm glad that they are going to extend the right-hand turn up to Old Drive, because the fire trucks cannot make that turn from Route 67 onto Old Drive now.
Mike Horrible for the Russian Club. I know this would add a lot to the construction costs, but was it ever considered to take Rimmon Street and make it an intersection right across from that of Church and Beecher? You would have to build a bridge, and I understand it would be extremely expensive, but was that looked at?
The short answer is no, and the reason why that's the case is you'll notice that Little River as it works its way up through and then back again underneath Route 67. So you've got a permitting, regulatory, and a constructability question that would create quite an issue for the project and would delay these improvements for some time. The funding that would be required to get a new bridge in that area, in addition to the other improvements, this bridge cost would probably trump the balance of what else other work we're trying to do on the corridor. And some of the primary focus has been some of the signalization and lane arrangements. Some of the problems you see today, we'll see a little bit later in the final simulation, shows that the timing and the coordination of these signals with each other are off right now, and they're not efficient. So that's part of the, and again, yeah, you've seen that. You go and stop and go and stop. So the intent there is to coordinate those better so that they move the vehicles through, so that once you stop here, you get to move a little bit more, not move, stop through the corridor. So again, we haven't looked at this. This was not identified as an option on the original 1991 study for a structural change here. It would create some significant regulatory and cost implications. I don't believe there has been a specific funding limit established for it. In order to do what would be considered a prudent and feasible alternative to that design, it would be whether or not this could stay alone. By having these regulatory impacts for the project, we'd have to demonstrate that there were no other prudent and feasible alternatives to the situation. As part of that, this may prove to still be the best prudent and feasible alternative compared to what the environmental impact might be at that location. Again, we didn't go through that analysis, but that could be one of the obstacles that that could occur. It wasn't identified as a primary area of concern that teeing these up and connecting them would be a significant improvement to the corridor, balanced with the costs associated with it. So the cost benefit analysis for that, I don't believe, was done in the original 1991 report, and we haven't done it here specifically for this project. That goes. Yeah, they mentioned that at the time, and that at the time there was a proposal to do something, and those improvements were not performed at that particular time. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know, on behalf of myself and Mr. Chetzabatka, who are property owners on that southern side of 67, at what point in this process will you be ready to make acquisitions? We are standing between a rock and a hard place here.
And I can address this, and Mark Nielsen from the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments also addressed it at our last meeting with the specific stakeholders. We're in the preliminary engineering phase. There's no rights-of-way acquisition process in the phase that we're in now. Should this project advance into the next phase, that would then initiate the other steps, which includes rights-of-way acquisition. So let's just say, and I think Mark had talked about sometime possibly next year, should this project move forward under its current hopeful plan, that the next year, at some point in time, the state and the project officials would be contacting the residents to start that process. And again, that could be a 2-year process, 18-month to 2-year process to go through the rights-of-way acquisition under the Uniform Relocation Assistance Act, which requires them to look at not only the property owner's impact, but any residents that are there, finding suitable business relocation, suitable resident relocation accommodations for the people who are there. Again, that's 2 years, possibly 18 months from next year, so it's 2016, 2018 as a potential acquisition, final acquisition date that may be possible for the project and for those property owners.
I think my wife brought it up last time. The problem is, we thought we had our life in order, and we're going to sell and retire August 2016 with a potential buyer in the wings. Now we will have a business that's going to be put out of business in a couple of years. What do we do now?
As you mentioned last week, we don't have an answer for you. We don't have an answer for you in this process. And I wish I had a different. I wish it was different than that. But the reality is that. Is it? I do. We do. And while I don't have an answer for you, I do understand the situation. Because this project, and I would agree with you. The reality of the situation too is that because this project is scheduled for federal funding, the federal process requires certain things to be done. It's a state road, and while we would love to be able to be in a position where we could advance certain elements of it, the people in the room here and who are designers and are controlling some of the local entities are limited because of where the funding's coming from. If the town had funding on its own to do this, it probably wouldn't make a difference because it's still a state road. State entities, state property, state acquisitions. If this is a local road, a little bit different process might be able to be followed, but because of the state elements that are involved here and the federal oversight and the federal funding, the process is the process, and I can't explain that or justify it any more than that. But we appreciate your comments for the record. Yeah. And I think it's important that you've expressed that because now it's been documented in the public record as part of this project. Moving forward, it's understood. But it's not a new piece of information, and that's at this point, that's all we can do is express that concern about the timeliness of whatever next step may occur.
Mark Solange, 47 Pershing Avenue, and also representing the Russian Club. We've all had our own ideas. We haven't really coordinated all of them. I'd like to point out another spin that I have. I've also spent a bit of time this past weekend since last week's meetings looking at this area, being a member of the Russian Club for the last 37 years. One of the things that bothers me the most is the expression of that this is too steep to come straight down. I don't think it's any steeper than the other side of West Street that comes right down to the light in 2 lanes right below Route 8. I traveled that a few times this weekend doing errands. The other thing too is where this could come down, there's a fire hydrant here, and using the same design elements that you're recommending for McDonald's, if an esplanade were to be made out of this corner and the other right lane going this way, which I sketched out here for you, maybe you'd want to protect the fire hydrant with a couple of posts for people coming down in the winter and also help identify. But there's a little bit of a hump right here. If that was regraded, it's regraded below all of the housing that's on the south side over here, and it would not encompass any deterrent to any of our parking. And it would give both lanes, the left turning lane and the now right turning lane, which is forced to turn right because of the design element of the esplanade, everybody equal chance to see what's coming this way because you wouldn't have to edge out. Just a thought, another input.
Thank you. Yes.
You stated a couple of times tonight that you know that the lights are off. Like the stop lights aren't. Okay, so before you make any major changes, why don't you do that and evaluate it over a time frame to see how that impacts traffic?
It's a great question, and it's a question that you can forward right up to the district office and DOT today. We here are not the maintainers of DOT's traffic signal system. We've identified it. We think it's a great idea. Well, it's in our report. It's been brought up as far as the particular project. The fact that it's a more current concern for you can definitely be raised to the top. How it gets handled at the district DOT level or at the Newington level is another question, but it's by all means, if there's an intermediate timing improvement that could be made in the interim between now and then, it's definitely a recommendation that can be made.
Just to add to what Mike said, there are some intersections that you just doing the timing improvements and the synchronization improvements would not be enough. For instance, the intersection of Franklin and River, you definitely need some additional geometric improvements as we've proposed. Those locations that are unsignalized, for instance, like maybe Beecher, where vehicles are trying to find gaps in the traffic flow to be able to get out onto Bank Street, there's definitely benefits with just timing improvements and coordination improvements. So in those locations, you can get some benefits, but there are other locations, like I said, where you definitely need some geometric improvements.
Just to add on top of that, also I believe that some of those signals are not physically electronically connected to each other today, where some are coordinated. They are coordinated. Okay, so there is a connection all the way through the corridor, electronically.
David Packard's cleaners. We see because we have this nice big window in front of us. We see the vehicles flying down the hill all day long. We can watch them run the red lights at Walgreens because red is the new yellow. And they fly down the hill, the construction trucks, not naming any companies, loaded with stone, easily going 50 miles an hour down the hill. I called the state and asked them what they could do to help us with this, to set up some way to get these people to go 35. And also because of this huge pothole, when they hit it, it's wonderful. And the troopers at the traffic division in the state said that we had to go to the town meetings because the town has to request the state to do that. So probably for the traffic light issue, we have to attend 1 or 2 traffic and safety street meetings in the town and make the request, which doesn't mean that they're going to take your advice either. Doesn't mean that they're going to call the state tomorrow morning and say, we got a problem here. So anyway, that's what was told to me, that the Trooper Thomas there at the traffic division said they can't do it without a request from the town. So the traffic light issue. And then, we all know the town put that wonderful speed limit information sign that flashes your speed in front of the subway so that when you're sitting at the stoplight, on the other side of the stoplight, you can see how fast you're going. I don't know what genius put it there, but boy, oh boy, that toasted me, boy. And now it's up there at the new stoplight on West Street with the stop sign. There is a flashing stop sign. These people are busy.
Jack Santor, Russian Club again. I just had one question. Is there any specific order which improvement would be made first? Is there any, you know?
At this time, there hasn't been a pecking order or a priority list of what improvement would be made first. Obviously, the bulk of the physical improvements and signalization improvements would occur on the corridor itself. The other areas are called also spot improvements. The scope of the work is a little less than some of the physical work it takes to build improvements on a state road. So in order to create these efficiency improvements in here to create the gapping, the signalization in the corridor is definitely something that has to be looked at as part of the improvements. Some of the lane arrangements, some of the safety things we need to address, the merging condition near Martha, those are things that really have been defined as a priority improvement area. So this area through here, this has been added into the project since the original study. This would also be an intention. But again, I think the primary focus would be in making the signalization improvements between Old Drive and the intersection of Franklin and Bank. And the other areas are supportive of that other improvement. I do want to continue on to the other intersection. What's that? What's that? So this condition here is that we talked about this the other night and last week. This is an improvement to address some safety concerns for vehicles coming out of Johnson Avenue. Johnson Avenue is a skewed one-way condition coming from the top of the hill down towards 67. We're proposing to formalize the end of that road. Now, we looked at several alternates. The preferred, but we also looked at a more traditional cul-de-sac that would be required on a town subdivision type road. Well, the footprint for that is about a 100-foot radius, which would take up most of this particular footprint of this particular property. We determined that wasn't a viable alternative. The volumes of traffic that come in the area are not that excessive. The other thing we looked at, can we take Johnson Avenue and bring it up to a T intersection with Route 67? Topographically, property impacts, engineering-wise, not a recommendation we want to make. Yeah. No. It'll be excessively safe. You couldn't meet a design standard to be able to construct that. Again, removed from a preferred alternative. This is a simple approach. As Mrs. Greco mentioned the other night, by creating this formal end to Johnson Avenue, really formalizes what people have been doing without permission for a while, which is come down to the end of the street, turn in her driveway, and come back out again. She expressed that as a current condition that she has today. We would then make some sort of physical restriction here that would allow only emergency vehicles. The details for those haven't been vetted out yet, but that could be raised, elevated sidewalk areas. That could be certain obstructions that the emergency vehicles can traverse, but a deterrent for vehicles, for passenger vehicles, etc. As we move across the street, again, this is more of a simple approach. We talked again last week about this. Currently, there is a sign on the wall that says no left turns coming out of the unsignalized entrance to the Clarities Plaza. Right now, vehicles do take that left turn. They're witnessed. I think you've all seen that as well. That creates a bit of an issue for the cars who want to come into the area, and also deliveries that come into this entrance as well. Some modifications would need to be made on the entrance, some widening and some radius improvements to improve the directions in and out. And then a formal restriction. What that island might be, it could be just simply, it could be a curved island to really make a formal statement. It could be a mountable island, depending on the needs of the deliveries for the site. Some sort of deterrent to keep people from moving into that left lane position and pulling out. Again, it's not permitted today, but it's used that way today. And improving that, what we also can do is that today there's a fairly narrow, slightly substandard configuration in front of that. Double yellow center line to the wall. Not technically enough room for two vehicles to come by. People do it. They squeeze by real tight. It's not really considered a comfortable, safe maneuver. This will bring the double yellow center line a little bit to the south, create a true pocket for that left-turning vehicle to come in while allowing the cars to move through the corridor. It's those other little stops like that occur on the corner that also affect your efficiency to the corridor. It takes one vehicle not to pull over all the way into a lane, and everybody else has to wait. Okay, so the long-awaited thing. Right. Do you want to run back and run the other one?
So this shows the future conditions with the improvements in place. I just want to point a few things out. In the condition without the improvements, we had a dedicated left turn lane here, which was backing up. What we've proposed is to make it longer, but again, it's not a panacea because there's restrictions to the bridge. So even though we are making the storage longer, there is still some backup, but it's better than what's the existing condition without improvement. But what you would see is, as we start running the video, the merge here is gone away. Now you have two through lanes going towards Martha, and you would see improved operations on Bank Street and also on Franklin Street with less queues. So, Tony. So as you can see, this doesn't back up as much. The same on Franklin Street as well, and also in the eastbound direction. It's a better. Now, as we come towards Beecher, you would see that because of the improved signal coordination, the queues aren't as long as before, because now vehicles are able to find gaps in the traffic flow and be able to make a left or a right out.
So, so in summary, what we've tried to present tonight is, again, is on a preliminary engineering level, is that there's been larger corridor studies identified, issues along the corridor to be improved. This project has narrowed in and zoomed in on some of those more specific. We've gained information from residents, part of the process. Well, earlier studies didn't do that. This study is doing that now. As we receive those, we then incorporate this process into what's going to be the official record, public record. 30 days from now, a period is open. Now, comments can be received from the public for an additional 30 days. If there's information you'd like to provide, that can still be submitted to the town, to the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments, to our office, incorporated in writing preferably so we can get it on the record. That's the 30-day process after tonight that then officially closes the public information process. At that point, the state, and through Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments, will make the decision on where this goes from there. We've identified several opportunities in the corridor. Are they final? No. You've raised some great questions as part of the process. Those are not, this is not your last opportunity to raise those questions. Hopefully this project moves forward and we can see implementation of some of those recommendations and some of the things you've seen in the final product here. Yes, sir.
Alex Budzinski, Housatonic Wire. The bridge between Housatonic Wire and Seymour Lumber on River Street, will there be a sidewalk for pedestrian access down there? Yeah. You're going to widen. Right now there's only one side there's a sidewalk. There's not on the other. If you're going to widen it, will there be a sidewalk going over that bridge?
As part of the some of our due diligence on this project, we reached out to the town because at the time there was some discussion about some development opportunities on that corner. So while it's not represented here, we identified a few things based upon where those plans might go. If there is a plan for redevelopment there, the connection for the pedestrians there is critically important for that area. We've left that kind of out of the formula right now without any further formal sidewalk connections all the way down River Street. There's an alternate in, I believe, our concept. If you go back to our conceptual plan, I believe we have it in the corner here too, where we have included in the funding as part of the preliminary design report, preliminary engineering report, a sidewalk element to that. It's an additional funding cost, obviously, to make the modifications to the bridge at that location, but it's an alternate in our report that is identified with a cost. Oh, absolutely. We have included it, and we think there's two opportunities for that. Either there's a sidewalk that's in the bridge itself in the right-of-way that makes a connection, or there's an independent connection dedicated to the connection to the site itself. There's an interesting jog and channelization of the river at that location. There should be some options, whether it could be an independent bridge, pedestrian bridge that comes over just to provide the sidewalk connection. That may be a cheaper alternate than trying to widen that particular bridge. It might be an easier way to get the... Something similar. Yeah. Yeah. So what we've done, we've included as one of the alternates in the report, the actual inclusion of a widened bridge and sidewalk at that location. It's not finalized at this particular time, but it's an alternate that originally wasn't in the recommendations, but we put it in based upon the request from the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments to say, get it in there. Yeah, get it in there when you can get it in there. Good, good. So that's the completion of our presentation. I'll take any further questions you may have regarding the project limits, specifics. Yes, Chet.
Yeah, Chet Sabatka. I'm actually from California. I'm out here. My brother owns property on 111 Bank Street, and he passed away in March. So I'm the administrator for his property. So I'm trying to really get a handle on what the future is. And I guess I don't have a warm fuzzy that these three establishments, the house and the cleaners, are truly going to disappear. They're going to go away. You know, I hear it should. I hear it likely will be. You know, and it, like David said, you know, you're putting us on a bubble, and I have to make a decision. I'm trying to sell the property, and I got to, make it be known that this is going to happen, and that's not going to give me any buyers. I already had the property out there for 3-4 months. I'm not getting any bites because of this, and I get comments coming back because it's on Bank Street, and I know what's going to happen in the future. So I just need to know a better way that this property is truly going to disappear, so we can really go forward.
If I hadn't stated it clearly enough before, in the preliminary engineering report is the recommendation that those properties be fully acquired, fully taken. So that is the recommendation coming out of the report, that this project will require the full acquisition of those properties.
Yeah, and I mean, that's where we go from here. We take all this input. We're going to go back. We're not just going to sit down with the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments. We're going to sit down with DOT. This is their road. And so we've got those concerns. And, it wouldn't be the first time that the state advanced the right-of-way acquisition. I can't stand here and promise that. I can't speak on behalf of the department. But when we can demonstrate, well, we're going to take all this information back, okay, back to the department. We have a counterpart, a project manager at the Department of Transportation who's attached to this project, if you will. And, to the extent that there's a hardship that can be demonstrated, like I said, it wouldn't be the first time. I just can't stand here and say that this one will go that route. But we've heard the concerns loud and clear. So trust, when we go back to the department in the Naugatuck Valley COG and we debrief, how did the public outreach go? These are going to be issues documented with multiple asterisks. That's why we're here. Okay, and to the extent that we can expedite the acquisition process, by all means. Yeah. So hearing you loud and clear, not being able to give any answers is frustrating on our part, believe me, but we heard you loud and clear and got asterisks on top of asterisks on that, and we'll do the best we can with that.
Mark, do you have anything to add? Fred, do you have anything to add to the presentation? Again, I do want to sincerely thank all of you for not only the attendance tonight, but last week. I think your input's been very valuable to the project. This is the kind of input that we'd love to get for projects, especially at this stage, because then they can move forward into design. We don't want to hear these questions or these answers, at the final design after too much ink has been put on paper. This is one we want to hear. We want to incorporate. We can plan better for it. So again, I appreciate your input, your thoughtfulness of bringing documentation to the meeting on a timely manner. Again, we're open for comments for 30 days. Feel free to send anything else in you might have, whether it's a deed for ownership or whatever it may be. And again, thank you again for your time tonight. Just as an FYI, we're going to close this particular public information meeting tonight, and we're doing another information meeting for the Seymour Greenway Trail. If you are interested in that, we are going to make a presentation about that. It is connected and adjacent to some of your properties. Thank you.